Death Daisy's Folly. Chapter 9. The chief folly of those who belonged to the Marlborough House set was to imagine that pleasure and happiness were identical. Frances Daisy Brooke, Lady Warwick, Discretions. Think too how to beauty they oft owe their fall, and what may through vice be the fate of you all. Anonymous 19th century ballad. Kate had been introduced to most of the guests the night before, and she had taken a few minutes before dinner to study the guest list, trying to match names and faces. But as she assumed her place in the line to go in to dinner, she still had to make a deliberate effort to remember which names belonged to which individuals. There was no mistaking the prince, of course, with those exophthalmic eyes that Victoria had passed on to her children, and that clipped greying beard and portly profile. He was about to lead the Countess into the dining hall. There was no mistaking the Countess either. Lady Warwick was dressed in a creamy tulle, with ivory velvet ribbons and a froth of lace that gave her a young girl's air of innocence. It seemed to Kate, however, that beneath Daisy's light-hearted gaiety was a certain apprehension. Perhaps, she thought, watching the Countess glance from the attentive prince to her debonair husband, chatting animatedly with Lady Forsyth, it had to do with the awkward situation in which she found herself. It must not be easy to manage both a princely lover and a husband under the same roof, even if the husband obligingly turned the other way when the occasion called for tolerance. But did he always, or did Lord Warwick sometimes object to his wife's affairs? Lord Warwick himself escorted Lady Lillian, brilliant in sapphire taffeta, with that rustled richly as she moved. Kate saw her catch Sir Charles's eye and speak to him in a low voice, with a smile that promised intimacies. They had obviously made an acquaintance at tea, perhaps. Kate couldn't help wondering, with a distinct uneasiness, whether Lady Lillian had brought up the subject of bats, and whether Sir Charles had found her remarks interesting. As for Sir Charles, unusually elegant but stiff, uncomfortable looking in his evening wear, Kate found herself torn. She had been hoping that they were to be table partners, and was disappointed when he was asked to escort Celia, a coyly self-conscious daughter of Lord and Lady Rochdale, who had only recently come out. On the other hand, she thought it might be better if she and Sir Charles did not have easy opportunities for conversation this weekend. Perhaps she could postpone the day when she might bring up the subject of marriage, and she would have to tell him what? That she was not interested? That was a lie, but it was better than the truth that he would not be interested in her if he knew everything about her. Behind Lord Warwick and Lady Lillian, third in the procession, came Celia's parents, Lord and Lady Rochdale. Lord Malcolm was tall and stooped, with a perpetual frown between his two small eyes, a long nose with a droop at the end, and pale, thin lips. Lady Verena's low corsage outlined her bosom in layers of lace, emphasizing her plumness. She wore a false black chignon with a bunch of fat black curls that dangled coquettishly over her left shoulder, several shades darker than her greying hair. Kate studied her uneasily, but if Lady Verena had received a telegram that gave away Beryl Bardwell's identity, it was not apparent from her demeanour. Her glance slid past Kate as if she were invisible. Nor did Ellie Farley seem to have found her out. Ellie gave her a warm smile and touched her arm. "You're beautiful tonight, Kate," she whispered, as she stepped into the line behind the Rochdales, on the arm of a handsome young Scots Guards lieutenant whose name Kate had learned the night before was Andrew Kirkesmythe. "But do relax, dear. You look as if you're afraid someone will bite you." Kate tried to smile, but without much success. In spite of the bare-shouldered elegance of the green silk gown that had seemed so grand in the privacy of her bedroom, she felt herself just plain ordinary Kate, an American, a red-headed Irish American at that, and decidedly out of place in the midst of such splendid company. The feeling was heightened by the joking, gossipy banter exchanged by the two pairs of couples that followed. Ellie and Kirkesmythe in the line, Lady Felicia Metcalfe escorted by a sandy-haired man of erect military bearing with a gold pince-nez, Sir Friedrich Temple, and Mr. and Mrs. Milford Knightley. Mr. Knightley, a turf friend of the prince, was a sardonic man with one glass eye wreathed in an aura of cheap cigars. His wife, several years older than her husband, was dressed in an olive-green gown that made her skin look sallow. Behind them came Lord Reginald Wallace, Bradford Marston, and the financier Samuel Isaacson, engrossed in a conversation about motor cars. Then, after some confusion about the order of the guest, came Kate, on the arm of a retired army officer with the surly black eyebrows, who glared at her and snorted, "American too, eh? Too many of you gals over here looking for husbands." The feeling of alienation persisted all through dinner, where Kate was sandwiched between the grey-bearded ex-officer with surly eyebrows, whose name she discovered was Sir Thomas Cobb, and Lord Malcolm Rochdale, who carried on a conversation with each other over her head. Lord Malcolm owned a country estate named Alwyn, not far from Chelmsford, and was building a grand new house there. That work and the construction of his stables occupied all of his thoughts, Kate concluded, for he talked of little else. By the time dinner was over, she had learned that the newly constructed house had 3 wings and the clock tower, and that the grounds were enclosed by a wall the height of his wife's head. The whole affair was constructed of locally produced brick, making it sound to Kate remarkably like a prison, and Lord Malcolm commented several times on the extraordinary amount of money he had saved by this expedient. "One pays attention to such mundane business as construction savings these days," he said, leaning forward to speak to Sir Thomas. Yes," Sir Thomas answered glumly. "Now that these ruinous death duties have been laid on us, we may all be constrained to build with cheap brick," which remark put an end to the conversation for several moments. If Lord Malcolm was obsessed with bricks, Sir Thomas was preoccupied with shooting. So far as this season, he confined it to Lord Rochdale. When they were speaking again, guests at the 3 shooting weekends he had hosted at his Warwickshire estate had bagged 200 partridges, 3,000 pheasants, and nearly 400 hares, bloody statistics which left Kate pitying the ptarmigan on her plate, a favourite of the prince, and feeling a trifle ill. But at least Sir Thomas had left off glaring at Kate and muttering about American gals. Now his scowl was directed across the table at Sir Reginald, Kate's luncheon partner, who had gotten into the tiff with Lady Warwick. Kate decided that Sir Thomas must have some kind of grudge against Sir Reginald, for he spent the dinner hour bristling his brows and grimacing at him, these quite remarkable facial gestures, accompanied by shoulder hunches and audible snorts and hisses. During the interval between the ptarmigan and the peas and the asparagus in aspic, Kate glanced up and down the table. The guests, 10 to a side, with Lady Warwick on one end and Lord Warwick the other, were decorative in their glittering jewels and gleaming shirt-fronts. They were attended by liveried footmen moving soundlessly in and out of the shadows, while the myriad of candles glinted off crystal goblets and rich gold plate. A tableau of social perfection. The picture of elegant and unceasing pleasure, of well-bred sophistication, of happiness. But glancing from face to face, Kate suddenly saw the scene as if it were a still life. The guests, frozen in various postures of eating and drinking, seemed to wear their countenances like smiling masks that covered the avaricious expressions of unhappy pleasure-seekers, with nothing to do but indulge their insatiable appetites for fine foods, fine houses, fine horses, and each other. And as Kate looked up and caught sight of Daisy Warwick, her face decorated with a strained, set smile, there suddenly seemed something quite false and entirely sinister about the scene, and she shivered. At the head of the table, Daisy caught Bertie's lovingly proprietary glance and returned it. But her customary smile covered a surge of cold panic. How was she to tell him that she had mislaid one of his letters, one of his foolish Fature's extraordinarily indiscreet love letters? Would he accuse her face to face of carelessness? Would he? No. Bertie, whatever else he might be, was the perfect courtly gentleman. Even if he considered her to be careless and irresponsible, he would not tell her so. He might, however, decide that she was not to be trusted. He might never tell her anything important again. Worse, he might. And then another thought struck her, and the panic became a tidal wave. What if she had not mislaid the letter, but it had been stolen? She did not deceive herself. Her personal maid, like everyone else, could be bought. And on the blackmail market, such an indiscreet document would be worth thousands of pounds. The panic closed over her head like a dark wave, leaving her gasping for air. Who could have done such a thing? Her glance went down the table to one face, sullen and jealous, and she felt a sudden cold surge of anger. Reginald Wallace would not have stolen the letter himself, but he was not above arranging its theft. And if that were true, if he had it, she might persuade him to give it back. Of course, she had no money to give him. She already owed him thousands of pounds, exactly how much she had forgotten. But he wanted something else from her, something that would cost her nothing. She took a deep breath, raised her chin, and smiled at him. But now the prince was speaking to her, and she had to retrieve her smile, silence her thoughts, and answer him with a witty charm. As the royal mistress before her had learned to their cost, His Highness must never become bored. Midway down the table, Sir Reginald Wallace caught Daisy's smile. What was it the woman wanted now? His forgiveness for her fickleness? His acceptance of a situation over which at bottom neither of them had any control? It was damned late for either the one or the other now, though. She wanted something more tangible, money, most likely. Her estates, her income, they were nothing compared with the fortune that went for clothing and jewelry and entertainment. Yes, by God, he recognized that glance. Later tonight he'd receive a note from her asking him to meet her at the Folly, where she would plead for him for yet another loan. The idea of it, of being with her again privately, or perhaps even touching her face, her hair, raised a sudden heat within him, and he lowered his head lest his hunger show his face. For all his disapproval of her actions and her dangerous affiliations, those were external matters and not the woman herself. His feelings for her had never changed, not even in those dreadful months after Margaret had died and everyone was whispering that he had killed her. He looked up and saw Sir Thomas glowering at him around the fruit-filled pern, flushed deeply and looked away, forcing his thoughts back to Daisy. She was going down a perilous road. Her socialist fellow travellers were scoundrels, or worse, plotting England's demise and the destruction of the monarchy. He might be willing to make her a loan, but to get any money from him she'd have to listen first, and he would warn her in terms she could not ignore or laugh away. He would tell her that there were persons close to the crown who saw what she was doing, feared she might succeed, and would do anything to ensure that she would not. His affair with Daisy might have cost him all his pleasure, destroyed his every happiness, but he loved her still. If it was in his power to keep her from making a ruinous mistake, then so he would. He looked up and caught Felicia Metcalfe's mooning gaze and scowled. Blast the woman. Couldn't she see she was making fools of both of them? The business in the upstairs hallway after tea had been uglier than he intended, and he wished that Scalawag Knightley had not heard so much of what passed between them. But he and Felicia were finished. That was all there was to it. He was a gentleman and hated public scenes, but was sick to death of her, and the sooner she understood, the better. And as for Knightley, Wallace's eyes narrowed. It was just about time for accounts to be settled. Knightley might think he could use that embarrassing business in the upper hall to get out from under his debt, but he was wrong. What Wallace had learned that morning completely eliminated Knightley's advantage. All he had to do now was collect. With half a smile, Felicia Metcalfe relieved Sir Reginald's glance and allowed the footman to refill her champagne glass. As she did so, she felt Mr. Knightley's bold, amused gaze on her. Her smile faded, and she looked haughtily away, feeling the hot flush rise to her cheeks. It was intolerable that Milford Knightley, that wretched man with his glass eyes and sardonic mouth, had overheard her little contretemps with Reggie in the upstairs hallway. He was such a reprobate, quite common, with nothing to recommend him except his horse-racing friendship with the prince, and that wife of his. Well, really. She glanced again at Reggie. Of course, he hadn't meant that angry little outburst in the hallway upstairs. During the after-dinner entertainment, she would let him know that her bedroom door would be open to him tonight. Or perhaps they could meet at the Folly, where Daisy saw to it that the bedroom fires were lit, so that thrifting couples could take their pleasure there. At the thought of Daisy Brooke, Felicia's lips compressed, and her jealous resolve hardened even further. Daisy was a selfish, manipulative woman who had used poor Reggie dreadfully, used him still, no doubt, whenever she could. And if sweet, foolish Reggie imagined himself still in love with that shallow schemer, well, as Lillian Forsyth had remarked at luncheon, one did quite relish a challenge, didn't one? Milford Knightley sat back, enjoying the consternation that he read in Felicity Metcalfe's face. The woman was a fool, and not even a particularly attractive one at that. Fancied Wallace in love with her, did she? That was a laugh. Wallace may have tumbled her a time or two when he had nothing better at hand, but he was still mad for Daisy. He'd do anything to have her, although he disapproved of almost everything she did. The folly of some men was quite remarkable. Knightley looked up to the end of the table, where the Countess, her bare shoulders emerging angelically out of a cloud of creamy tulle, was carrying on a laughing conversation with Bertie. Daisy Warwick's ability to command foolish hearts was remarkable too, and that was precisely what made her such a problem. That, and her ability to hide her real purposes. Who could guess that behind that lovely face was a damned dangerous woman? Still, he thought he might somehow be able to use her to get ready to forgive that annoying debt of his. To be sure, after this morning, things had become more complicated. But since Wallace himself was involved, his advantage was limited. Knightley was sure he could turn the situation to his benefit. After all, that was his special talent, his unique gift, capitalizing on others' mistakes and judgment, on the track and off. Still, one had to be careful. People could only be pushed so far. His gaze moved across the table, and he caught the chilly eye of the dignified, austere Sir Frederick Temple, sitting opposite, and smiled. He knew exactly how far to push Freddie. Sir Friedrich, a tall man with sandy hair and beard, and a stern eye that passed judgment on all he witnessed, looked coldly away from Milford Knightley's self-congratulatory smile. Sir Friedrich found the man vulgar, inferior, and unworthy, and he regretted the necessity of any sort of association with him. Why Bertie so foolishly cultivated his friendship was way beyond Sir Friedrich's understanding. Surely there were plenty of discreet men of good family who shared Bertie's passion for the turf, pugilism, fast women, and immoral revels, but even as a young man, H.R.H.'s most attractive personal characteristics had been his capacity for comradeship. His friends were legion, and because he was almost completely indiscriminate, they were of all sorts even. Sir Friedrich glanced at Samuel Isaacson's Jews. Bertie called them his wicked boys. The press referred to the Marlborough banditti. The Queen called them the Prince's downfall. There was a great deal more that Sir Friedrich had never been able to understand or accept where Albert Edward was concerned. A man in his position, who might any day find himself on the very throne of England, ought to be circumspect in all manners, or, if he could not restrain his baser instinct, at least be discreet. Moreover, he ought to be involved in issues of state, so he could take up the reins of government when the time came. And here, even Sir Friedrich, a devoted friend and fervent supporter of Queen Victoria, who had helped the royal family out of several tight places already, had to admit that Bertie's mother was seriously at fault. Over 3 decades ago, when the prince was still in his 20s and the Queen had decided that her son's unprincely escapades, some of them less than savoury to be sure, rendered him unfit to represent the crown, she had excluded him from every significant duty with a sadly predictable consequence. The future king, at bottom a well-meaning if intellectually limited man, had grown into a middle-aged bon vivant who filled his days and nights with senseless, perilous frivolities. The Queen felt, and Sir Friedrich and others of her inner circle agreed, that Bertie's gambling, drinking, and womanizing endangered the dignity and stature of the crown. In fact, Lord Salisbury argued that in these days of rumoured uprisings among the lower classes fanned by socialists and anarchists, Bertie's notoriously uncontrollable behaviour threatened the very existence of the monarchy. Unfortunately, Crown Prince Eddie, Bertie and Alex's oldest son and heir, appeared to have been cut of the same cloth as his father, or at least very nearly so. For over a decade he had fallen into first one disgrace and then another. It was over now, thank God, ended with Eddie's funeral 3 years ago. But the unfortunate Eddie's vices and inadequacies had been trivial in comparison to the business upon which Sir Friedrich was currently engaged. The Queen was deeply distressed over the recent Tranbury Croft gambling scandal, which linked the Prince and Daisy Warwick and provoked the Times to pontificate upon the heir apparent's distressing fondness for wild house parties, where money was won and lost on baccarat, and men jumped from one woman's bed to another. Sir Friedrich had promised the distraught queen to do what he could to persuade R.H.R. to drop those of his friends whose influence was most dangerous. To that end he had managed to obtain. But no matter, one would see how it all came out. A footman stepped forward to refill the glass with champagne, and he looked up to find the American woman watching him curiously. The Americans, quite charming they were, and much more free and natural than British women. Randy Churchill's widow, Jenny, for instance, a beautiful lady amazingly accomplished. Randy had married better than he deserved. Sir Friedrich smiled at Miss Audley, undeniably attractive, at least as pretty as Jenny, and 15 or so years younger, and lifted his glass in a cordial salute. During the evening's entertainment, he would make her acquaintance. A friendly American woman might be just the breath of fresh air he needed to clear out his stale head. There was certainly nothing wrong with taking a bit of pleasure in one's work, and she might prove very useful.